Hey guys, what's going on? John here from What's Spinning here tonight to chat about this new Bat for Lashes album, Lost Girls. Bat for Lashes is the singer-songwriter project of Natasha Khan. Over the years, she's touched down between indie rock and indie folk, as well as baroque pop and art pop. And at first, I really wasn't that into Natasha's stuff. 2006's Fur and Gold showed her trying to bring some mysticism and some elegance into the world of indie rock and indie folk at the time. And honestly, I kind of felt like she knew where she wanted to be, but she just wasn't quite there yet. But around 2009, around the time of her Two Sons album, I really honestly feel like Natasha blew it out of the water this time around. She started bringing in elements of art rock and synth pop and baroque pop, and honestly made one of my favorite albums of that year. Glass, Daniel, Sleep Alone. There are so many truly amazing tracks on here. It's ambitious, but it's also super catchy as well as very mysterious at times, and I genuinely loved that. 2012's The Haunted Man, honestly, very decent album as well. It is a little more artsy and a little more elegant, and true to its title, pretty haunted most of the time. Not to mention the Kate Bush influence here is like absolutely in your face. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And even 2016's The Bride is an interesting album to say the least. It's this really bizarre concept album fueled with this thought of a bride left at the altar and her groom was killed in a car accident or something. I mean, I say or something because, to be honest, the narrative of this album was its weak point. I mean, I'm fairly certain that there were aliens involved by the end. That was just odd. But as far as the content inside the album goes, I always thought that it was actually pretty decent. Tracks like Sunday Love still stand out to me in a big way. Now, Natasha is back, and if you've heard any of these latest Bat for Lashes singles, she is going in a massive 80s retro synth pop way, and honestly, that's something that I usually go nuts for. Let's chat about this thing. Album starts off with Kids in the Dark, and honestly, Natasha has been tampering with synth pop for years, but it's never been this apparent. No, this isn't just a little synth pop here and there, this is a total 80s throwback. But comes off very humble and actually full of life. While maybe a little bulky, none of it comes off cheesy, and Natasha's performance is actually super tender. As a matter of fact, her entire performance here just gives this track just enough of a human touch. Also, the M83 vibes, especially early M83, those vibes are certainly real here. Overall, love this track. The Hunger, on the other hand, is a little bit more straightforward, also has a lot more funk built into its main riff. Now, I should say there is a certain campiness to this album, but it's almost done on purpose. Like, you can tell that this sound and this style meant a lot to Natasha at some point. She's really paying homage to it. But honestly, this track is actually really stunning. It's epic. It's also very adventurous. Not to mention, nothing here is really that cheap sounding. It's not like Natasha's just putting a cute little 80s synth here and there and calling herself retro. No, she's encapsulated this sound, honestly, to a T very quickly, and this ends up coming off like a love letter to the 80s. And the drama and the sheer emotion in the last 2 minutes, this is just a great single. Yeah, a lot of this album is a very daring, risky new direction for Bat for Lashes, but honestly, I think Natasha pulls it off. When it comes to tracks like Desert Man, like honestly, Natasha is so on this sound. Once again, I love how cinematic this track is. It just comes off very vast. Now, I have to say, much like the Bride narrative, I am a little lost here. But as lost as I am with that, everything else about this track I'm kind of in love with. The pounding drums, the immense synths, and of course Natasha's performance, this track is actually pretty amazing. Then we have Jasmine, the very chilly vibes here, and the spoken word performance actually gives me a big chromatics vibe. And I can only say that more once we get to the very catchy chorus. But it really does end up roping you in, and I love how genuinely mysterious this track gets at times. It's something that Natasha's been able to master for years. And yeah, it may not be as elegant or triumphant as her stuff from like Two Sons, but still, for me, this is hitting the spot. And shockingly, Vampires might be my favorite track here. It's just so hazy, so dreamy, and in a weird way, maybe even sleazy. But honestly, it really does encapsulate everything about this sound in that era. As a matter of fact, I would have loved to hear the rest of this album get this treatment. And honestly, it's just so simple, but yet so effective. Like that saxophone and the plinking synths towards the end, it's just very obvious, but it works for her. Save Tonight continues with that very cinematic edge, but at the same time, this one is a little bit more straightforward. And while I would usually kind of point that out as a negative, honestly, I think that this track is pretty freaking awesome. I love how gloriously campy this track gets, without a care of just how silly and how ridiculous some of these lyrics and topics are. But because Natasha is such a freaking ridiculously great performer, I ended up taking her completely seriously through it all. It's actually one of the sleekest tracks here. And by this point, yeah, the narrative for me, like, I'm lost. I'm sorry. It's just not that easy for me to follow. But I also don't really care because I think that the content of this album is pretty great. And Peach Sky is really enjoyable as well. Natasha's vocals are not shrouded with anything here. They are some of her most up front. And honestly, I love just how triumphant the synths are here. And lyrically, hell yes, this is ultra cheesy and ridiculously sunny. But after just how dreary and mysterious and dark a lot of this album has been, it's actually a pretty great change up. Now, there are a few missteps here. Feel For You is kind of tough for me. I have a lot of very mixed feelings on this one. I mean, this one is, for an early track in the album, very bouncy and almost fun. Don't get me wrong, you're getting a lot of the same elements like the throwback synths and the funky guitar licks. My only real criticism here is I think that Natasha kind of threw her songwriting out the window on this one. I mean, it's fun, it's funky, it's a nice little shift, but I feel like this one could have gone harder. And the only couple of other tracks here I'm honestly not that really into. For example, So Good is by far the worst track here. This 80s throwback sound is great for Natasha, but obviously, it's a very slippery slope. Yes, most of the time it comes off very cool, very interesting, very different, but there's times where it comes off super cheesy and just not for me. Now, I actually think the dark, chilly atmosphere is really great. But for the first time on this album, I feel like I'm in the midst of a cover song, and that's a problem. As a matter of fact, it's something I feared I'd hear a lot more of on this album. Not to mention, there's been a couple of other cheesy tracks on here, but Natasha has saved them. This is not one of them. This track is actually pretty awful. And Mountains as a finale is actually really not that good either. Look, I actually think that this album deserves one last powerful ballad to end this album off. That's great. But for me, this just isn't cutting it. Once again, some of the sentiments here are actually genuinely sweet and could have really been worked in nicely. And Natasha's vocals are some of the warmest here. But the total package on this one just doesn't seem to add up for me. There's a disconnect here. Even when this beat gets going, I just can't get with this. It just ends off the album on this ultra cheesy moment, which probably should have been a thing, but it's just not this. So, overall, this is a very interesting album from Bat for Lashes and Natasha Khan. I've loved her for years. She's always tinkered here and there with synth pop. It's always been more of an art rock and baroque pop and chamber pop thing for her. But here, she goes totally 80s, and honestly, most of the time, it's pretty much a blast. I mean, yes, it's cheesy. Yes, it's over the top, and I think Natasha knows that herself. And because of her ridiculously bombastic performances, time and time again, I'm able to take it more seriously than most people probably should. I think it's a blast. Yes, there are some ultra cheesy songs. Yes, there are some tracks that sound like covers. And yes, this 80s sound is a slippery slope and could get very messy very quick. But for now, I'm enjoying this album. I'm feeling a strong 7, maybe a light 8 on this album. But let me know what you guys think down below. If you liked the video, be sure to give us a like, give us a subscribe, and let me know down below what you would like for me to chat about in the future. And until next time, have a great day, guys.